Hi, everybody. This is Back to Basics, Building Resilient Cyber Defenses. And if you could see my really cute slides, it also says, but make it garden in really cute script. So shout out to the Crypto and Privacy Village for having such an awesome theme this year, which is gardening. So we're going to talk about cybersecurity using garden analogies instead of military ones to make it a little bit more accessible. And it's a pretty ambitious talk because I'm not only going to talk about gardening metaphors, but we're also going to try to give you a framework to evaluate digital security advice and compare and contrast sort of like viral security advice with the tried and tested security advice. And I'm also going to describe all these slides. So I'm going to be going pretty fast. But yeah, my name's Yael, and I'm a program manager doing cybersecurity research at Consumer Reports. And I'm also an investigative tech reporter, and I run a data broker opt-out list to help people remove their information from people search sites. And if you could see my slides, there's emojis for a lot of my hobbies, many of which are nature-based. I am a serial plant killer, but I've grown a lot of vegetables, and I have a lot of nature-based hobbies. So I've been helping people stay safe online for a really long time. And these slides say cybersecurity basics, and they have some cut and pasted advice like get a password manager and set up multi-factor authentication. And then it says, but make it garden. So this is the kind of information that you get a lot when people start talking to you about digital security advice. They'll tell you to do these basic things that haven't really changed over time. They'll tell you to, get a security key, use a password manager, make sure you have unique passwords for each account, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of the more tried and tested advice. And one of the first things that you'll learn when you're just starting to look into digital security is to think about your attack surface. And this slide here actually has a garden plot that's it's like a raised garden plot and is part of a community garden. Because I feel like some of the militaristic language is a little bit less accessible for certain people because they'll tell you think about your attack surface and your attackers and attack vectors. And I like to think of it like garden plots because you probably are not going to plant things in other people's garden plots. You are worried about your own garden plot unless somebody asks you to help them with their plot. And sometimes this can expand, like if there's an issue in the entire garden, so your garden plot or the areas that you're taking care of will expand. And that is also true for digital security, where new vulnerabilities can be introduced and expand what you thought was the area that you had to protect. And then the next slide that I have, it says layer defense, and it says soil layers, and there's 5 different layers of soil. So on the very bottom is your bedrock, followed by weathered rock fragments, and then there's subsoil, where some of the deeper roots can dig into, and then topsoil, where some of the shallower roots dig into, and then on the top is your humus layer, which is where your actual plants grow, like you can see your plants and flowers and stuff like that. And so I like to think about layer defense in terms of soil layers because there's a lot going on that you can't immediately see that will affect the health of your plants and drainage, nutrition, etc. And so when you're trying to figure out what to do, sometimes you have to kind of dig deeper into the root of things. And this is very different than the military example, which is layer defense and defense in depth, where instead of putting all of your soldiers on the front line, you're kind of putting some of them back further so that if somebody attacks you, they can lose strength over time. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it, and this is one that I thought was kind of interesting for this theme. The next slide that I have here says sun and water and nutrients, and there's a beautiful picture of a forest with the sunlight peeking through and somebody watering a plant. And I think about this a lot because I feel like there's certain things that are necessary for online communities to thrive, including having good trust and safety teams, moderation, and stuff like that, but also making sure that things are private and secure by design. So these are things that you kind of need. It's a little bit more complicated because you don't want to overdo your sun or water. So it's not a perfect analogy, but there's basics that you can put in place, maybe in slightly different ways, but the concepts are the same. And then the next slide that I have says walled garden, open garden. And I really like this analogy because it actually is a gardening analogy that has made its way into talking about technology. And I lived in England for 8 months, and there was a lot of gardens that were extremely manicured. And I always think about them when I hear people talk and complain about walled gardens. And it's a criticism that's been leveled against tech companies when their information is not transparent. There's like data silos, it's monopolistic, and there's just limitations to what you can do with your own data, and on and on. But there's situations where like a walled garden approach might make sense or something similar to it. Like if you're managing a fleet of devices and want to make sure that they are secure, you might want to have more control over what you allow on them. And then this next slide is an open garden, and it's a beautiful field of flowers, because you can have gardens that are not as regimented, that are beautiful and thriving, but you can also have ones that are kind of overgrown and abandoned and completely out of control. So this is kind of an open, ongoing issue about how do you deal with transparency, diversity, cost effectiveness, while also dealing with like fragmentation and complexity and so forth. And then my next slide here, it says mulch and landscape fabric. And these are things that you use when you are worried about weed infestations. No matter what garden you find yourself playing in, there's things you can do to set yourself up for success. And you can either do this before it happens, or you can kind of try to deal with it after it happens, which is a lot more difficult, as anybody who's spent time trying to eradicate weeds knows from experience. Okay, the next slide that I have says threat models, aka plant hardiness zones, and there's a map of the 2023 USDA plant hardiness zone. And your hardiness zone is basically a zone that is designated that tells you what kind of plants you can grow in your area by taking into account temperature, rainfall, and things like that. And I think this is super useful to think about, because if somebody just told you you should plant strawberries, like that might not make sense for you based on your location. And I think this is something that cybersecurity can learn from the gardening community, and how you think about things, because sometimes people will just throw out generic advice that does not actually make sense for people. So if you are someone with memory issues, it might be a good idea to share your password manager password with somebody. If you are in an abusive relationship, you don't want to share it with anybody, maybe, or anybody that would get it to somebody who might want to do harm to your account. And I feel like this is something you learn really early on as a gardener. When people give you gardening advice, you make sure that it is applicable for your location. Or it's like customized for your devices that you use and what you're trying to do. And sometimes people might even want to send you to somebody else. Like if you ask them, how do you garden in a swamp? And they don't actually garden there, they'll be like, oh, I know somebody who has done that, so I will send them there. And then the next slide I have says your threat landscape changes with your environment and ecosystem. And there's 2 images, and one of them is of the Sonoran Desert. There's like a lot of cactus, and one of them is like a marshy swamp. And so like I live in Arizona, so our threats are, jumping cholla cactus and scorpions and heat exhaustion and rattlesnakes. Even the plants try to store as much water as possible. And people don't worry about that everywhere. So if you go to Florida, you might be more concerned about things like heat stroke, but you're also worried about like alligators or cottonmouth snakes or black widow spiders or things that I don't know about because I don't live in Florida. So again, these are just like conceptual, and we're going to kind of dive in deeper to see how this applies to actual security advice. The next piece of advice, my slide has a picture of a plant with frost on it, and it says prepare for specific situations and events, because people spend a lot of time. I don't know if you've ever, raise your hand if you've ever tried to prepare plants for frost. Yeah, so you're like harvesting all your plants before the frost hits in case it kills them all. Maybe you're covering up trees. You're gonna water really well before the frost. And so I feel like this is also true in digital security when you're preparing to do something, whether it's going to a protest or like a border situation or something like that. And so what you normally do might change when you apply it to these specific events. My notes are all over the place. My next slide says, quote, expert advice. And there's a quote by Anne Lamott. It says, I picked up a book on gardens so I could study flowers and trees and vines in that way. And honest to God, people who read my novel believed that I loved to garden until I let them know that I had only been winging it with a lot of help from people around me, people who knew a lot more about gardens than I. So I think it's really funny that because she wrote a lot about gardens, everybody thought she was a gardening expert. And this is something that also happens in digital security, where people repeat information from other experts, but they can't answer questions about context. It might not actually apply to the people they're talking to, or it might be completely wrong and they don't actually know. So I think it's important to kind of pay attention to, like, who are you getting advice from, and like what information do they have, and where are they getting that information? My next slide says viral security advice, true or false, which I know is what you are all actually here for. Because sometimes I see security advice online, or I'll get texts from people asking me, like, should I do this thing? Should I disable ad ID tracking on my phone? And so I usually ask them, like, what are you trying to do? What is your hardiness zone? Is this actually something that you need to be worried about? Do you have to worry about scorpions in Florida? Like, what are you actually doing? And there's been a lot of kind of viral videos. I've seen stuff all over the internet saying you should disable ad ID tracking on your phone, which is really great advice if you're trying to make it harder for data brokers and advertisers to track you and follow you. Like, I don't want a company to create a dossier of all my locations. I think that's creepy. I don't want to sell them to sell it to third parties, even if I do post some of my locations on Instagram. But those are curated, and of course, some people don't post those at all. So I don't think this is bad advice if you're privacy-minded, but I think sometimes people think this stops all tracking, and it doesn't actually do that. And I've also heard people give this advice to people who are worried about, like, a stalker or abuser. And it's true that companies having your data, well, before you think about, like, can companies have my data? How do I stop them from having it? If you're worried about an actual person having your data, make sure you're not in the same Google Maps account. Make sure you're not sharing location information with somebody you know who's friends with that person who will get them that person. So that's the first thing that I think people in that situation should do. So when you see this advice, again, out of context, I think again about hardiness zones. Like, if you are worried about companies having your data, there is a different set of steps to follow than if you're worried about stalking, which again is different from somebody worried about identity theft. So I think that this isn't necessarily harmful or incorrect advice, but it's not appropriate for everybody. And I think it's because saying it depends is never going to be like a sexy soundbite. And saying, what are you trying to do or what are you worried about is also not like a viral soundbite, but it's something that applies to, it's something that you need to think about doing. And then when I was trying to give viral security advice, I actually crowdsourced it and asked people to send me what they had seen. And some people sent me some articles saying you should stop using Signal, which is pretty funny because I feel like this repeats over and over again. Like, every year there's a new article claiming that there's some issue with Signal and you should stop using it. And I think that, like, it's because negative information spreads faster than positive information, even if the negative information is inaccurate. There's actually been research on that. And most recently, I saw an article that was critiquing the funding for Signal and, like, salaries. Some people don't like it when people make industry-level salaries. There were some false claims about metadata being stored on Signal servers. And a lot of people who say, you shouldn't use Signal, I heard it's a government offer, whatever, will then recommend using Telegram or something that's completely insecure. So I think this is an instance where kind of tried and tested use Signal, use Tor advice actually wins, because Signal isn't compromised. Somebody making industry wages does not make end-to-end encrypted messages less end-to-end encrypted. And I think this is advice that I can say you should safely ignore. The next piece of advice that I got was about using a VPN or antivirus software. And I've written about VPNs for almost a decade. And again, this is so contextual. Like, why do you actually need a VPN? And I always think about somebody I met, a professor who told me that she was really nervous that she wasn't using a VPN when logging onto her bank account because she was worried that she was going to get hacked. And it is probably kind of unfair that I put this under viral security advice, because this used to be tried and tested advice before HTTPS really took over the internet. So a lot of reasons that people use VPNs to protect themselves from things, like they already have that level of protection. You already have encryption when you are logging onto your bank account. And I think the reason that this advice propagates is because it's easy to sell VPNs and because there are a lot of people that get a lot of sponsorship money from VPNs that you might see on YouTube. I'm not saying don't use a VPN. I think it's just important to think about like, what are you using it for and what are you trying to do and will it actually help you do that? And also just being aware that there's so much ad tracking that a VPN cannot defend against. It's not the be all and end all, like digital fingerprinting, etc. And so this is situational because it depends. Like if you're in a country where you're trying to engage in censorship circumvention, then yes, use a VPN. But it really matters what VPN you use. So it's just not as easy to say use a VPN, use antivirus as it is to use Signal. This next piece of advice that I've seen a lot is I've seen a bunch of videos saying leave your phone at home when you are going to a protest. And I think this is so situational and such a personal decision that people need to look at the pros and cons because I know a lot of people who wouldn't even make it to the protest without their phone because they would get lost. There's also something to think about is that you can't easily call your friends for help, or if there's an emergency, people might have a more difficult time contacting you or coordinating with you if you don't have a phone unless you've set up a different way to communicate. And so it limits your access to information, it makes navigation difficult, and if not everybody in your group is doing it, I don't really know how helpful it will be. But it does make you harder, it makes it harder to track you digitally, so I think it's good advice for some situations. But the kind of concern I have about this hardline approach is that people aren't actually learning steps they can take that can make them more safe if they do have a phone, like turning off biometrics, because police can't require your password, but they can require biometric access. So the other funny thing is that I see people posting selfies of themselves and their friends without phones, like online in real time, which kind of defeats the purpose. So this is kind of the situation that I equate to, like, would you tell somebody to get a house plant that is really tricky if they kill plants all the time? Probably not. But if somebody does have like a very specific type of plant that they like and are good at handling it, then yes, like, you should be able to do that. But it gets really complicated. People talk about burner phones a lot too, and it's like, are you carrying your burner and your regular phone at the same time? Does this defeat the purpose of doing it? So there's lots of things to think about that are more it depends than would seem. And then this next one that I got that comes up a lot is advice to avoid period tracking apps. And when Roe was overturned, people were suddenly concerned about period tracking apps and whether they would be used to criminalize things like miscarriages, irregular periods, etc. Or if you have an abortion in a state where it's legal and return to a state where it's not, that kind of thing. And I feel like this is a really easy thing to write about because it's really easy to switch apps. And there are some that are more secure than other apps, but this is kind of neglecting the fact that when we haven't seen evidence of investigations of people based on this app data yet. And the biggest threat of criminalization is somebody reporting an individual to the police, whether it's a so-called friend or like a medical worker. And so, yes, you can use better apps to protect your data, but also police are not arresting people based on data and database at scale, at least not yet, that I'm aware of. And the other thing I worry about is that like people might stop using them altogether, which can make it really difficult to make decisions if you don't know how pregnant you are and you might want to leave the state. Like there's an actual downside to this that I think some people haven't completely thought through. The next piece of advice that I got was use special settings to prevent AI training on your data. And I feel like this is still up in the air for me because I don't think a lot of companies have meaningful opt-outs yet. And I don't even know if there's a way to check that your data is excluded from the training. So here I feel like the better advice is the use Signal advice, because if I don't want to type in anything that if there's something that I want to type that I don't want to exist forever and possibly be used in association with my name to train data, then I would just not put it in I would just keep it to Signal. Okay, I have 5 minutes. I'm going to power through this. The last two pieces of advice that I have here are cover your laptop camera and disable your microphone. And I had people that were emailing me that were very upset because they were told to cover their laptop camera, and then it damaged their screen when they closed their laptop. It messed up their brightness settings. I don't know. Like for me, like I'm more worried about the cameras that I cannot see than the ones on my laptop. So I don't think this is necessarily bad advice. It's just not in my top 10 or even 20 pieces of advice. And the last one that I saw that I tried to kind of think through was disable your microphones. And the advice was to switch the default microphone to a headset or external mic and then turn it off when you're not using it. And so just thinking through this, if somebody phones my laptop, and I have, well, first of all, my mic is the last thing I'm worried about. If somebody has root on my laptop, I'm not as worried about my mic as other things. But I also wonder, like, what is this person who like can, enable your mic, but wouldn't be able to re-enable it if you turn it off? Like, I can't really think of a way that could happen where somebody can has root on your computer, you turn off your microphone and set the default to something else, and they can't like switch it back on. So yeah, I don't know about that advice. It's on the fence. I'm on the fence. So the premise of this talk was comparing viral new advice with tried and tested advice, but there's actually like not a super clear way to differentiate between them, because some things do change over time, like VPNs, and sometimes there are new vulnerabilities that are introduced. So I'm just trying to get people to kind of have a better framework for when evaluating this information and making decisions based on what you're trying to do, what you're concerned about, and what might come up. And the slides here are these beautiful fuchsia flowers that I took at Bouchard Gardens that I wish you could see. One of them says old-fashioned or newfangled, and then it says questions, and then I have my email, which is yael@yaelwrites.com. My Blue Sky profile is yaelwrites.com, and I am on Mastodon at Yael Writes. And I think I have time for maybe a few more questions, but I'm always interested in discussing this more. So.